Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the Extra Mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now, your host, Jackson Mummy, owner of the Celebration Bar Review.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 247 of the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. This is your host, Jackson Mummy. Glad to have you with us. We did kind of a different schedule this week. Earlier in the week, we put out a special bonus episode, episode 246, all about the Florida bar exam results from February 2019, and that threw off our normal Wednesday schedule a bit. So this is our normal Wednesday podcast a couple of days late, but we're glad that you're with us and found us. And by the way, if you don't want to miss anything, be sure to subscribe. You can do that on Apple iTunes or Spotify or iHeartRadio. And of course, you can always watch our video versions of the podcast by going to celebrationbarreview.com and then / and the episode number. This week it's 247, so celebrationbarreview.com/247. You can also go back and check all the older episodes just by clicking on the podcast tab at the top of our page. Well, in any event, it has been a busy week. A lot was going on. We had the Florida bar results that came out earlier in the week. We had a couple of other smaller jurisdictions report results as well. And now we are in the holding pattern. The next big state will be the New York results. I expect those near the end of the month of April, but we don't have a specific release date ever. So we just kind of wait for our spidey senses to tell us when the exam results are going to drop. In any event, I'm excited, though, about today's episode because a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to appear as a guest on someone else's podcast. The podcast is called LSAT Unplugged, and the host is Stephen Schwartz. And Stephen is a really interesting guy. He runs an LSAT course that's online. He's a real genius at the LSAT. He did not go to law school himself. He just took the LSAT and said, man, I don't need to do this. I'll just prepare people to take the LSAT. And he uses a lot of the educational techniques that we've employed in the bar review. Well, in any event, Stephen contacted me a while back and he asked if I would appear as a guest on his show to talk to his audience about the bar exam. And we did that. We had a great conversation. And I thought, well, you know, this conversation really is about the bar exam. It probably applies more to our students in some ways than it does to his. So I asked Stephen if I could recut the interview just a bit and put it on our podcast. And that's what we're doing today. So in today's episode, you're going to hear a conversation that I had where I'm not the one asking the questions, but answering them. So that was kind of an interesting flip, and talking a little bit about the LSAT and how it relates back to the bar exam. Now, I think this is particularly interesting in light of an article that came out earlier this week. The multi-state bar exam scores nationally went up by just a little over 1 point on the mean in February of 2019. That's good news, although some big jurisdictions like Florida, the MBE score actually went down. In any event, as part of the article, the chairman or the president of the NCBE said that she wasn't quite certain why scores were going up, particularly for repeaters, and that they were looking into it, but they just couldn't figure out why repeat bar takers might be doing better in some places. And my response was, maybe because more people are taking Celebration Bar Review. In any event, I think that there is a correlation, but not the correlation between LSAT and the bar that is typically talked about. And you'll hear me discuss that a bit in this interview. I do think there's some commonalities in the skill set, but I don't think that the LSAT is a predictor of performance on the bar in quite the same way that I think, Judith Gunderson, the president of NCBE, would claim it to be. So it's just an interesting sort of a byproduct, I think, of the discussion that's happening now generally around the bar and what makes for successful results. Now, speaking of successful results, before we jump into the interview that I had with Steve, I want to remind you and share with you that this episode is sponsored by our webinar training called Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. Now, this training is a 90-minute look at what you have to do in order to pass the bar. It's a step-by-step process. We'll include lots of case studies, lots of examples, lots of clear and I think very direct instruction about what it takes to actually pass the bar. It's completely free to attend, and it's Thursday night at 7 p.m. All you have to do is jump onto the show notes, either here on the video page or on the audio page, or by going to celebrationbarreview.com/webinar. Now you can click right in there, sign up, and then Thursday at 7 p.m., be prepared for 90 minutes of really intense training on what you have to do in order to be successful on the bar exam. I think it's going to surprise you to find out what really makes for success and what isn't successful. And I can tell you that thousands of people have been through this training. It's been life-changing for lots and lots of people. So I hope you'll join us Thursday at 7 p.m. for Do Something Different. Make the next bar exam your last bar exam. All right. Well, I'm not going to keep you waiting any longer. Let's jump into this interview in which I was the interviewee and got the chance to talk a little bit about the LSAT and the bar exam.
Jackson, welcome to LSAT Unplugged.
Hey, thank you, Steve. I'm glad to be here.
Thanks so much for joining me. So I understand that you do bar exam prep, you have a bar exam podcast, and my audience of pre-law students, a lot of them are asking me already about bar exam prep, and I don't do that, but that's your specialty. So I'm hoping you can share some insights with our audience today.
That's great. I'm always excited, particularly when people are starting to think about the bar exam early on. And it's not too early to think about bar exam, even when you're studying for the LSAT, because the process happens so rapid. That very first hour practically on the law school campus, they're talking to you about the bar exam, right? What's going to happen is, you remember that day you went to undergrad in the first week of undergrad and they offered you free pizzas and t-shirts if you buy a credit card, sign up for a credit card? It's kind of the same thing for bar exam. You're going to show up at your law school campus and they're going to say, hey, you need to sign up for a bar review. And you don't even know what the bar is yet. And there are a couple of big companies that we call the big box bar reviews. That's because they just give you a big box and leave you on your own. But they're really good marketers and they drop a lot of information and they make you think that you got to sign up for a bar review in the first week that you're in law school. And that's not true. You don't need to do that. And you definitely don't want to do that without doing some comparison shopping and looking around to see what the options are. So in the same way that I think someone that's thinking of preparing for law school and taking the LSAT probably wants to look at some options in terms of how to study. And I think for your audience, Steve, if they've already used an online home study course, they ought to consider an online home study bar review because it follows the same kind of continuity and pattern in the way that you study and approach. So I think there's a natural flow that happens there.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I find that online and self-study is becoming more common than ever before due to the convenience, go at your own pace, wherever you are in the world. So I know that part of what you offer in terms of bar exam prep is a podcast. Can you share a bit more about your podcast and what you do with it?
Sure. We have a weekly podcast. It's called The Extra Mile for Bar Exam Takers. You can find it on Apple iTunes or Spotify or iHeartRadio. And each week we try to talk a little bit about what's going on in the bar review world, results that are coming out or new trends or new techniques. I talk about study skills and strategies. But really my favorite part, honestly, is that I get to interview past successful students after they found out that they passed the bar. If you're familiar at all with Dave Ramsey, the financial guru, he has people come on his show and yell, I'm debt free. It's kind of the same thing for us. You know, we have people that yell, I've got my life back, because, you know, you're putting your life on hold to go through law school and then to take the bar exam. It's a long process. From the time someone contacts you about LSAT prep until the bar exam, it could be 4 or 5 years from start to finish or more. And so it's a big chunk of your life. And so what we try to do in our podcast is help people walk through that season of their life so that they know that they're not alone, they're not isolated, and they're not crazy, which is one of the ways that I think a lot of people feel when they're like, oh my God, does anybody else in the world know what I'm going through? So we try to give them a sense that they're not alone.
That's awesome. Yeah, having a community is so important. I find when I speak with students, they often feel like they're alone and isolated and no one in their everyday real world experience is going through that study process. But having that feeling of a shared community, especially through the internet, of course, is I think enormously valuable. But I want to zoom out a little bit just to share with folks, what is the bar exam? What is it testing? What do people need to know about it overall? Will law school prepare them properly, or will it kind of be something else altogether?
Yeah, that's a great question, Steve. The quick answer is law school is not teaching you anything about the bar exam, no matter what they tell you. They're two entirely different worlds, just like what you learn for the LSAT is not what you learn in law school, right? They're different worlds. They're different skill sets being tested. The bar exam is testing your ability to use the law in a variety of different subjects, anywhere from about 14 up to 20, 25 different subjects, some of which are state specific, some of which are what we call general or multi-state. Now, every state in the U.S. has its own system for the bar exam, and it consists of typically 1 or 2 days of state-specific testing, and then 1 day of a general test called the multi-state bar exam. The multi-state bar exam is a 200-question multiple-choice test that covers 7 broad topics, things like tort law, contracts, property, constitutional law, and so on. And it is a very difficult test, and it comprises typically anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of your score on the overall exam. The state day of the exam, and it differs depending on what state you're in, but typically there are some essay questions, there may be some multiple choice questions for that state, there may be something called a performance test, which is really nothing other than just a practical writing assignment that an attorney might do in real life. But all of this is done under time conditions. It's all done with the book closed. And so one of the myths about the bar exam is that somehow you have to memorize and recite rules to pass. Well, that may be more like what happens in law school, but in the bar exam, that's not what they're testing. They're really interested in your ability to use the law as you understand it and to apply it in a reasonable, thoughtful way, which is why there's such a tight correlation, interestingly enough, between LSAT scores and bar scores. It's not what happens in the middle in law school, but what happens is that, as you well know, someone who does well on the LSAT that has good relationship and reasoning skills, that can do logic games, that can do analytics, that has good vocabulary, those skills are exactly the skills that you're going to apply on the other side at the bar exam with a base of knowledge that you've acquired over a period of time, and of course that a good bar review supplements. But the truth is, we could give you all the rules. You could be, Dustin Hoffman as the Rain Man, right? And have all the rules, but have no common sense, no ability to use them, and you would fail the bar exam. And this is one of the great surprises to people, is that you're not being tested on the law in the LSAT. But then you go to law school, you learn the law, you come out of law school, and you think, well, what they're going to test me on is the law. No, we're really going back almost to testing you the way the LSAT tests you. We want to see if you can take a fact pattern, a problem, break it down and see where the arguments are, and then see how to use the law as you know it to support your position, and then reason like a lawyer. Think like a lawyer is what we talk about. But thinking like a lawyer is what the LSAT's designed to measure, isn't it? I mean, among other things. And so if you're not good at logic and reasoning and analogies, you're going to have a hard time on the bar exam. These are comparable skills in my view.
That is so funny to hear, because I kind of thought that the LSAT it's correlated with bar exam passage rates, but it's also correlated quite well with first-year law school grades, and I believe that's why the American Bar Association considers it a valid and reliable test. But what I'm hearing from you is that there's kind of a gap where what you do in law school is a bit different than what you do on the LSAT. And so it's kind of like you have this 3-year gap where you're not refining those skills necessarily, so it may require some freshening up on them.
My view has always been that someone who does well on the LSAT is going to be a high achiever, first of all. Secondly, they're going to have really good verbal skills. Third, they're almost always going to have good rational, logical thinking skills. Those skills will do very well for you in a first-year law school environment in which you're called on to recite and you're asked to write basic essay questions at the end of a final. Those things are pretty transferable skills. When you get into your second, third year of law school, when you're doing more law work and less just pure learning the law, your LSAT skills are valuable. If you did well on the LSAT, you're going to do pretty well in law school. But if you did poorly on the LSAT, you're going to struggle in those second and third years of law school, because you may have a deficit in your ability to reason, or in your ability to do logic, or in your ability to analogize. And those things are going to make it very difficult to be successful outside of pure rote memorization. And so we sometimes see a strong correlation between an LSAT score and a first-year law school score. But if you actually watch in the second and third year, the correlation drops off pretty dramatically, and I think this is why. And then we come back around to the bar exam, and the correlation comes back again pretty strongly. Now, I don't ask my bar students what were your LSAT scores. Most of them can't remember. It's an interesting phenomenon. We live for that LSAT score, and then but I don't remember what it was, right? But if you did well on the LSAT, such that you had choices of law schools and you were above a minimum passing score, you are bright enough, you're smart enough to pass the bar exam. But you have to use a lot of those LSAT skills on the bar exam. But it was so long ago that a lot of people forget that they learned how to do those things. And so we have to reteach them, right? We have to teach them again how to analogize. If this problem looks like this, if I change the facts, does it still work, right? Do those problems still apply in this new fact pattern? It's pure analogy. Or I've got a logic problem, X, Y, and Z happened. What's the outcome of that? I like it when someone's done well on the LSAT. It tells me that they're a good student, but it also tells me that they've got the requisite skill set that we can build on for the bar.
That is really interesting because, of course, principle and application, dealing with fact patterns on the LSAT, and then, of course, extracting the principle perhaps. So it goes in both directions. So it sounds like the bar exam is kind of like the LSAT once again, but maybe even possibly harder.
I mean, I can be very, very smart about a lot of things, but not know anything about the law. I'm going to have trouble on the bar. Smart people are going to do well on the LSAT. I mean, let's face it. If you did well in your ACTs and your SATs, if you're a talented, capable student, with preparation, with a course like yours, you should do well on the LSAT. I think that's a given. I think the more interesting question for me as a teacher, and I don't know how you feel about this, Steve, but I'm always a little more interested in the person that's not the superstar, but more in the middle of the pack, who has the potential to do well, but hasn't found a way to capture that potential yet, to really take it and understand what's going on. And so for us in the bar exam, and I suspect this is true for you as well, one of the things we want to do is to try and help that student understand what skill is being tested. If you understand the skill that's being tested, if you can deconstruct the test, you have a much better opportunity then to deliver the skill set that the tester is looking for. So if I memorize a lot of rules and go to the LSAT, it doesn't do me any good. I can memorize a lot of logic rules, but it doesn't do me any good until I apply them. In the same way, if I memorize a lot of law in the bar exam but don't know how to apply it, I'm going to have a problem. So the interesting piece is, how do you deconstruct a test in order to make it work for the student so that they can say, oh, that's the skill I've got to demonstrate in this part of the exam.
Yeah, I would agree with that quite a bit. I think that the LSAT, if someone's a great test taker and great at the multiple choice, then I do think it'll come pretty naturally. But that's maybe 1% of people. I think that most people need some help to figure out exactly which principles they're not getting, which skills they need to hone a bit more. So it sounds like we're of like minds there. There's one thing that's sticking out to me, because the law school, of course, is not multiple choice. The LSAT is multiple choice. And what I gathered from you is that on the bar exam, part of it's written and part of it's multiple choice. Is that correct?
Right. Yes, that's right. And so anywhere from a third to a half of your score typically will be in multiple choice. So one of the things I'll hear from people who say, I'm not a good multiple choice test taker. And often when I ask them what the basis of that belief is, they'll say two things to me. They'll say, I didn't do well in law school on multiple choice tests, but then they'll often say I didn't do well on the LSAT. And I find that really interesting because by definition, you did well enough on the LSAT to get into a law school, and you did well enough in law school to graduate. Therefore, definitionally, you're not bad at multiple choice. You're just not, in comparison to other people or to where you think you should be, you're not good enough. But that doesn't mean you're a bad multiple choice test taker. And I find that people talk themselves into this hypnotic trance about things like this. I'm no good at, fill in the blank. And then we convince ourselves of that. And so if I say to myself all day, every day, I'm not a good multiple choice test taker, well, I'm probably not going to be a good multiple choice test taker because I've convinced myself that that's just a skill I don't have. And yet you and I both know it is a teachable and learnable skill.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because the thing about multiple choice is that whatever your previous experience is, it doesn't define you. You can learn and you can improve. So I think what you want to do as a student, as a test taker, is you want to externalize that and say it's not some innate unchangeable quality within yourself. You know, especially the LSAT, the bar exam, you're up against a very difficult cohort of people. You know, you could be 95th percentile on the SAT, but then drop to 70th or 50th percentile on the LSAT because you're up against a more competitive pool.
Yeah, exactly. And so we tend to play the measurement game. You know, I look around and think, well, you know, pretty smart. You know, I thought I was pretty smart as an undergraduate. I got to law school at Georgetown, and I was an older student. I mean, not old, but older. And so I found the other 5 older students in my group of 600 classmates. And, you know, we're sitting around looking at each other a first day or so, you know, and so, okay, what did you do before you came here? Well, one guy says, well, I was the backup in the backup band for Billy Joel's latest world tour.
Wow.
And the next person says, well, I was Ted Kennedy's chief of staff for medical issues in the Senate. Okay. Third person says I was the heir to the Utz potato chip fortune, right? And then they looked at me and I said, well, I was an Amway distributor. I mean, it's, there's a point at which you kind of go, whoa, these people are smart, right? And it can be intimidating. And I think sometimes we get this great sense of confidence. We get a good score in the LSAT, we get to law school, and then we look around at all these smart people and go, holy cow, the whole room is smart. And then we start thinking, maybe I'm not so smart, maybe I'm not so good. And by the time I get you 3-4 years later, you've been so beaten up by law school, and there are fewer sadistic law professors today than there were when I went to school. But there's still enough of them out there that I get students who are really literally PTSD. They're shell-shocked by the experience, and they start believing they're not good at something like multiple choice test taking. So our approach to that is to use what we call selective intuition, which simply means that we want to read into your non-conscious brain and into the bigger part of your brain, the information that you need, so that as you're reading a problem, you have an intuitive sense of the answer first. And you move from that intuitive answer down more deeply into selecting the correct answer. That's an inverse approach from the idea of eliminating wrong answers, parsing words, trying to figure out rules and memorize substantive law. But what happens is that when people use this idea of selective intuition, they're more accurate. They're better tuned in to what the exam is doing, and they're not tripped up by the things that might stop us otherwise when we're trying to parse too closely.
That's a really interesting idea. Are you able to give some general example where we might imagine this being applied?
Yeah, if we've got a contracts problem and we're given a fact pattern, which is the structure, and then we're given 4 answer choices. As we're reading through the fact pattern, we probably first have a sense of whether or not the plaintiff or the defendant is going to prevail given the fact pattern. Bob contracts with Sally to build a house, and Bob completes most of the house, but he doesn't put the paint on the final room of the house. Sally sues him for failure to complete the contract. Who wins and why? Well, as I'm thinking about that, my intuition tells me, look, he pretty much did most of the house, but he didn't complete it. But it's not a huge thing he didn't do. So I'm pretty sure that Sally's not going to win in terms of not having to pay for the house. So now I'm looking for something that says either Sally wins but doesn't get everything, or Bob wins because he substantially performed. And as I begin to look through the answer choices, if I see something that matches that in general terms, then I go right to that answer and I mark that and move on. If I don't see any of those choices there, if that's no choice there that looks like that, then I've got to rethink the problem because my context is wrong. But most of the time what we discover is that fact patterns repeat themselves just like they do in the LSAT. There are patterns in the questions. There are things that as you begin to look at them, I could say, oh, that's a certain kind of logic game. I've done those before. I know the general pattern and approach to take to that, and it gives me a roadmap to work through the problem. So all we're trying to do is to help people spot the patterns and then selectively intuit what the answer is without sitting there and struggling through and parsing. If I started to say, for example, well, maybe it was the wall of the kitchen, would that be more important than the wall of the third bedroom, right? I mean, you can make yourself nuts. Or maybe it was the wall of the garage, but that wasn't in the fact pattern. So people tend to overthink, and it's been our experience on the bar that when you overthink, you usually miss the question. We've actually done some interesting studies. We have lots of data points. I've been teaching the bar for 30 years now. And one of the things we discovered, we assumed that the longer someone took on a question, the more probability of a correct answer. That is, the more I study it, the better I'm going to be. When we actually put it on, we used an online system that kept a timer from the time someone opened up the question until they answered it, and then told us if they got it right or wrong. Now, typically, you might expect in a bar exam question, it's 100 questions in 3 hours, so you can do the math. It's a little more than a minute and a half. You would think that, again, the longer someone thinks about the problem, the higher the percentage correct. That's not what happened. If you mark it immediately, not correct at all. But the sweet spot was about 70 to 90 seconds after someone started reading the problem. In other words, if they marked their answer in 70 to 90 seconds, they had a much higher probability of being correct. After 90 seconds, it's like dropping off a cliff. If we get to 100 or 105 or 110 seconds, there's virtually no chance of getting the correct answer. So the longer you spend on a question, the worse you're going to do on it. Now, that kind of blows up our normal thought process about how somebody studies. I mean, shouldn't I struggle with a question and think about it and work hard on it? You know, do I get a degree of difficulty points like in diving or gymnastics? And the answer in the bar is no, you don't. And so we want people to move through the questions rapidly, because if you can answer in that 70 to 90-second sweet spot, we know that's the best probability for success. It's an interesting piece that we've discovered over the years.
That is fascinating. And I can definitely relate to that in some way. The timing isn't quite the same on the LSAT per question, but I have noticed, of course, that if someone isn't making headway on a logical reasoning question, for example, after 2 to 3 minutes, it may be best to flag that question and move on and hope to come back to it later. And the benefit there is that you break out of your previous tunnel vision with some distance and some time, giving it a second look. You can come to see it a different way. But people get stuck in this kind of quicksand, and the clock is ticking. Like the bar exam, the LSAT is strictly timed, 35-minute sections. And so you can't really afford to throw minute after minute after minute into a question when that may lead you to not get future questions later.
Yeah, I love that concept of tunnel vision. You know, a lot of times on the bar, you go on to something else and suddenly it pops into your brain, you know, oh, that's what I want. That's what counts. I just got a new computer yesterday because my old computer after 6 years gave up on me. But the spinning wheel of death, you know, when it's grinding, that really is a great analogy, I think, for what so many test takers do. They grind on a question, they start to fixate on it, and then, you know, they can't let go of it. It's like, oh, I got to work on that one. No, don't do that. When you're done with that question, even if you've marked it to come back later, you got to let go of it and move on. Your brain will actually give you an answer if you let it. But beyond that is the longer you fixate on that, the less attention you're drawing to the next question you got to deal with. And so we see this sort of long tail of poor performance after a bad question. That's why people tend to miss questions in chunks. They have a bad question, they get a wrong answer, and then they start worrying and fixating about it, and it distracts them through the next 2 or 3 questions. And that's a really dangerous problem that you want to be aware of.
Yeah, it's a mental game. It's nothing more than a mental game where you feel discouraged and you feel like, oh, I got this question wrong and I got that other question wrong a section or 2 ago. My score is tanking, but it tanks because you get so wrapped up in the few questions you've gotten wrong. Like on the LSAT, you can get 10 wrong and still get a 1.
You can miss a lot of questions and still pass. And, I liken it to the concept of a football player. They say a defensive football player, a safety or a cornerback, has to have a short memory. You know, you may get burned for a touchdown. You can't worry about that. You got to get back out on the field and keep playing. And I think there's a certain truth to that in high stakes testing. You're not going to succeed on every part of every question of every exam. So you need to be willing to let go of the things that aren't in your wheelhouse. And if that's not your strength, don't worry about it. Do the best you can and move on. But don't keep looking backwards to say, oh, what about that? Or that's killed me. You know, it's so frustrating when I talk to students who say, well, something happened to me early on in the exam. I mean, we're talking about a 2 or 3 day test in the bar. And they'll let something from the morning of the first day still be impacting them on the afternoon of the second or third day. Well, that's disastrous. And so you really have to do just a complete eternal sunshine of the spotless mind. Yeah. Remember Jim Carrey, wasn't it? Right?
The movie where they wipe the memory. Yeah.
You got to wipe your memory. You just got to go, okay, it's done. You know, whatever that was, and keep moving. Otherwise, you are dooming yourself, at least in my experience.
That is definitely true of the LSAT as well. One other thing I wanted to circle back to, Jackson, is that idea of selective intuition. There is something very similar that we talk about with the LSAT, which is the idea of pre-phrasing or predicting the correct answer after you read the logical reasoning stimulus before you move on to the answer choices. And I think one reason this may work is because a lot of times you know where they're going, but the wording of the answer choices could throw you off. So don't use the answer choices to supply you with the wording or the articulation, because obviously the test makers don't want to phrase it in the simplest way, right?
Yeah, exactly. But you know, it's a great skill, that pre-phrasing or intuition, because it narrows your focus down. It lets you move faster. If I know out of 4 choices that I've got 2 choices of a plaintiff winning and 2 choices of a defendant winning in my example, well, if I think the defendant's going to win, those are the 2 choices I want to look at and figure out which one of those is best. I don't need to worry about the 2 where the plaintiff wins, because even if it's been phrased in weird ways, it's not the right outcome. And so it's very nice to be able to do that process. And it comes through practice. I mean, just working questions until I saw the patterns of the question and could anticipate where the answers were going before I saw them. The more I could anticipate them, the better I was going to do. If you're doing enough practice questions and anticipating and then reviewing your answer choices when you're done, that's a terrific way to learn. Now, it's not exclusive. I mean, we do lectures and we do outlines and we do all sorts of other things to help. But I think that ultimately that three-legged stool of a lecture, an outline, and question practice is what makes a difference for people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, we talked about how law school is a bit different from LSAT prep and bar exam prep. We have this 3+ year gap that we talked about. For those who are starting law school this fall or next fall, what might they want to do over the course of law school to set themselves up for success on the bar exam?
That's a great question, Steve. First of all, one of the myths is that you should take classes specifically for the bar exam. Don't do that. If you're not interested in secured transactions, don't give up a semester of your life, hours that you will never get back in your life to learn that subject. You don't need it. We'll teach it to you in the bar review in a matter of hours because we're not going as deeply in the weeds. We don't have to teach you everything that you need to know about that subject if you were going to practice it. So don't pick your classes based on the bar exam. I think that's one thing for sure. A second thing in my experience is learn how to be a good writer. Take writing classes, get into clinics, get into situations and circumstances in your upper years, second, third, fourth year, where you're writing a lot of papers. Not taking tests, but writing papers. The better writer that you are, the better you're going to do on the bar exam. There's no substitute for good writing, wherever the subject is or whatever the subject is. Good writing is going to be clear. It's going to be straightforward. It's going to make sense. It's going to be organized. It's going to be logical. And that will be true no matter what. And those skills are invaluable when it comes time for the bar exam. One of the questions that people will ask me is, when should I start studying for the bar? And the answer is you can get your bar review materials at any time you're in law school, but they're going to make more sense to you after your first year of law school because typically the first year of law school curriculum includes many of the subjects that are on most bar exams and certainly the multi-state. But it doesn't cover everything that's on the bar. So it's nice to get some of that under your belt to get the pressure of the first year of law school out without adding on extra things to do. The old saying was the first year of law school, they scare you to death, and the second year they work you to death, and the third year they bore you to death. There's truth in that. The first year is so terrifying for most people, at least the way I remember law school, that adding on bar review study, I think, is just unnecessary trauma. You don't need it. In the second year of law school, you are typically working hard. You're interviewing, you're getting into classes that maybe are more interesting to you, you're doing more intensive work. And you may find it helpful to have some bar review materials if they coalesce around some of the subjects that you're taking or some of the in-depth material that you're doing, but they're not critical at all. As you start your third year of law school, if you're in a 3-year program, that's a pretty good time to begin to look at a bar review because now in your third year, it is more leisurely. Typically, you've got a better idea of what you're doing. You know what jurisdiction you're going to take. I mean, for people at national law schools, this is not everybody's problem. But if you're at a nationally ranked law school, you probably don't know what state bar you're going to be sitting for. It's going to depend on your job prospects. So if you're at a Georgetown or a UVA or Harvard or Yale or Stanford or Michigan, you may not know where you're going to go. And there's no point in buying a bar review when you don't know what state you're going to be in. Sounds crazy, but true. And so waiting till the third year actually makes some sense at that point and then getting started with it. Now, let's say you're at a school like Cooley, which is a very low performing school. I suspect you don't have a lot of your students that go there because they've got better LSAT scores. But if you ended up at Cooley, that's okay. It's a perfectly fine law school. And now you're going to have all of these bar classes that the law school makes you take because the law school's got to get a certain bar pass rate. So the final piece of advice I've got is if you have to take one of these bar classes to graduate, go ahead and take it, but hold your nose all the way through it. In other words, it's about as useful to you as some of those LSAT courses that are out there that tell you, things that you and I both know aren't true about how to study and prepare. There are certain ways that work, and then there are ways that don't work very well at all. Most of the law schools that teach the bar exam have absolutely no idea how to teach bar exam at all. It's not what they do. It's not their skill set. And so they end up giving people bad information that we have to unlearn or reteach them when they get out. They simply repeat what they've been doing in law school because that's been the mythology of the bar exam handed down over the years. So don't get sucked into those things. Don't follow the crowd. Make your own decisions. Start early. We like to see students starting anywhere from 6 months to a year before the bar exam, studying about 10 hours a week. That, in our mind, is the best pattern. Can you study in a shorter period of time? Sure, but it works better to do little bits of pieces of information over time. We call that stepped or spaced repetition rather than trying to cram. So that's a really long answer to your question, but those are the things that jump out at me.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And this idea of spaced repetition, that's supported by the data. I've come across that idea as well. It really does work. And part of it is the repetition, but part of it's also the spacing, the time, not saving it all to the last minute, not cramming.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of working with Howard Gardner, who's the creator of the multiple intelligences approach to education. He was part of Harvard's Project Zero that we collaborated with here in the town of Celebration, Florida, right outside of Disney World. And I was on the faculty and worked with Howard and others in taking best practices in education. This was 20 plus years ago. And Howard back then was talking about this idea of spaced repetition. He said, if you think about how children learn, they learn through repetition, not through memorization. But he said, there's an interesting thing. It's the spacing of the repetition. It's the ability to take information, set it aside for a while, then bring it back and then add a new piece to it, then take it away, bring it back, add a new piece. So you're creating a stair step as you go along. And his approach, his theory back then, which I think now is pretty well established as being the norm, is that the most effective way to know something is to be able to incorporate it, integrate it, internalize it, and then bring it back and add a new skill. So if someone's going through the LSAT and they learn some of the basic building blocks of logic games, for example, you get those, you take them away for a little while, bring them back, and then add another skill. You start to have real mastery instead of, here's 100 concepts, let me just drop them all on you at once, and you memorize them and then try to figure out how to use them. It doesn't work very well.
Exactly. You build and layer step by step, but you do still come back to things every now and then so you don't get rusty.
I think that there's this sort of sense of learning over time, learning in small pieces, bit by bit by bit. And I think if you've learned how to take an exam like the LSAT, which I always believed was a teachable exam. I had people when I took the LSAT who said, well, it's an intelligence test. There's no way you can improve your score. It's like, oh, that's crazy. Of course you can improve your score. Learn what the test is, you can do better. You've proven that over the years with your course. And when people do that, they begin to realize that they can learn, they are teachable. And so if you remember that you're teachable, that you learned a whole set of skills for the LSAT, which most people then immediately forget, which is to their detriment, I think. But if you've learned those skills, then you learn some more skills in law school about the law, and then you're going to learn some more skills about the bar exam, which is a preparation to actually practice law. And when you get to the actual practice of law, you're going to learn a whole bunch of other skills that you never heard about before. So, it's a constant lifelong learning process. And I think that if we treat that as a lifelong process instead of a one-off event, we're going to be more successful. Students will be more successful. And frankly, they're going to be more satisfied with the result.
Perfect. I love it.
So let me flip the tables here, Steve, and ask you a little bit, ask you to describe your course just a bit and how people could find out about your LSAT course, because I know we've got some people listening to our podcast who are probably saying, I'm just thinking about the law and where do I get started with all this?
Perfect, Jackson. I really appreciate that. So my name is Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT blog. I've been coaching the LSAT for over 10 years. The LSAT blog is kind of the culmination of all my writing on everything related to LSAT and law school admissions. More recently, I've started the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. You can find the YouTube channel at youtube.com/LSATblog, and you can find the LSAT Unplugged podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and pretty much everywhere else.
Perfect. And we'll link to those in our show notes so that people can find us. I had the pleasure of doing some reading into your blog and looking at some of your material. And I just want to say, I think it's super material. I think that you've taken a really great approach to the science of learning, the process of learning. It's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today, because there's a difference between just memorize these 25 rules, of LSAT and really, and somebody that really breaks it down. And I think you do a terrific job of doing that. And I'm sure that that's rewarding for you to watch people raise their scores as dramatically as it appears that they do.
It is, Jackson. Thank you for saying that. And by the way, I love what you've done with the bar exam prep. I think the bar exam podcast Extra Mile is such a great resource because you're just putting it out there. People can binge listen if they want to. And so I think that a lot of the folks on my end are definitely going to want to start listening to your resources and kind of dipping their toes in the bar exam prep waters.
Yeah, it's fun stuff. And, Steve, if you ever get crazy and decide to go to law school, let me know,
Right, thanks. You'll hook me up, right?
But you may have taken the wiser approach all the way around. It's fun, isn't it, to be a teacher? It's such a different experience.
It really is, honestly. There's nothing else like it. Just watching students have those transformations. It's what keeps me going on this, honestly.
Yeah, I think it's terrific. I wish you'd been around when I was taking the LSAT, but you'd be much older now.
I'm already listening to the podcast anyway, just to get a taste of what it's like, but I'll definitely want to do more.
Well, great. That's our episode for this week. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I thought it was an interesting one to have, certainly from the perspective of someone who's not yet gone to law school in taking the LSAT, but for us as people who are already in the process of taking the bar, sort of looking backwards a bit and thinking about what we've already learned in life and what we've learned about testing. So look forward to more conversations, and we'll put links in our show notes to Stephen's courses, LSAT Unplugged, and his blog. So if you know people that are at that part of their journey, you can direct them over there. He's a great guy. All right. Well, we will see you again next week. We'll try and get back on a regular schedule on these podcasts. And just want to remind you that we do have our upcoming webinar on Thursday night at 7 p.m. Do something different. Make the next bar exam your last bar exam. You can register by going to celebrationbarreview.com/webinar or just clicking on the button in the show notes or the link in the audio show notes. Have everybody have a great weekend and look forward to talking to you next week along the Extra Mile. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at www.celebrationbarreview.com.